For week 2 of American history, we're going to get started with a map of early English settlements. Remember last week I mentioned that there were many colonizers, many countries coming in, but that we were going to focus on specifically North America because we're studying American history. And so the map today pinpoints where English settlements began. And the thing that I want you to notice is that they were primarily along waterways. And as we fill in the names of the waterways, if I go too fast, just pause the video. And also, as I go through the waterways, keep in mind the question, why was it so important to settle nearby water? So we'll go ahead and get started. To the north, we have the Kennebec River. And south of that is the Merrimack. Notice that those have native place names. The Connecticut River, another native place name, and the Hudson River. The Mohawk River, the Delaware, the Susquehanna, and moving to the south, we have the Potomac, the James River, the Roanoke, the Cape Fear River, the Santee, and finally to the south, the Savannah River. Your instructions do tell you to go over each of the rivers with a blue colored pencil or with a crayon, so make sure that you do that also. Now we'll go ahead and fill in the names of the English settlements that were along the rivers. To the south, we'll start with Savannah, Charleston, New Bern, Wilmington, Jamestown, Williamsburg, St. Mary's, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, New Haven, Providence, Plymouth, Salem, Boston, and Hartford. We're going to move to the south again and go ahead and fill in the settlement of Roanoke. Remember that Roanoke was the English settlement that didn't last. They tried to start a settlement there. They ran out of supplies, and there was the whole ordeal where the people who were sent back for the supplies got caught up in an English war with Spain and couldn't get back to Roanoke for 3 years. And by the time that they arrived back, the settlement was gone. To this day, it remains a mystery as to what happened to the Roanoke settlement. Now, the directions to your map also ask you to look up the original names for New York and Wilmington. New York, you're going to be reading about that this next week, and so if you want to wait until you come across the original name in your reading, that'd be fine. Wilmington, you'll probably have to do a quick Google search. Go ahead and fill those in. Then your map instructions ask, why did most early settlement occur along rivers or other bodies of water? And that's something that I asked you to think about as you were filling in the names of the settlements. And so there's a number of reasons why people would have wanted to be near water. First of all, you need to drink water, so you want to have a source of fresh water. So that's one reason. But also, you might have a time where it's not raining enough and you want to use some of the water from a river or a lake or a pond or a stream to water your crops with. But also keep in mind that it was very important to be able to be near water because of transportation, whether that was bringing in more supplies or being able to evacuate if you needed to. And so let's go ahead and fill those reasons in. And then I'm going to let you fill in number 6 on your own. Just don't forget to do that. Now, last week you were given a guide to critical thinking in American history. Recall that I said that every historian, whether it is the author of your book or the teacher of your class, comes to history with preconceived ideas and notions and biases, and they're going to teach the lessons based on the beliefs that they already have. And so it is good for you as a student of history, whether that's in my class or in future classes, or just reading a book casually when you're older, to be able to pick up the kinds of reasoning that people are using. And so during the course of this class, we're going to be teaching you how to critically think about the information that you are given as part of your history course. So last week, we mentioned that people make arguments or assertions, and that those arguments and assertions are stronger when they are backed up by evidence. And so remember that evidence is stronger if there is a source given, and one of your critical thinking exercises this past week was to evaluate different assertions and to decide whether there was a source for the information given or whether there was no source given. Today, we're going to take another step along the lines of learning to evaluate evidence. And so if you'll go ahead and get out your critical thinking guide, we will pick up where we left off. The next little section that we had was titled Evaluating Evidence. And the paragraph begins, "Only when you know the sources of evidence can you judge how reliable the evidence actually is. Frequently, you can use the following evaluation method when considering evidence and its sources. This can be shortened to PROP, or P-R-O-P. Good sources will prop up evidence." We're going to start with the first P. And the first P is just a question. Is the source a primary eyewitness or a secondary source, not an eyewitness? Primary sources are invariably more desirable. To reach valid conclusions, you need to realize the importance of primary sources and gather as many as possible to use as evidence in an argument or an assertion. You should depend on secondary sources like encyclopedias or history textbooks only when primary sources are unavailable. So P is primary or secondary. R, if the source is a person, does he or she have any reason to lie or to distort the truth? Would those giving the statement, writing the document, recording the audio or video, or identifying the object benefit if the truth were distorted, covered up, falsified, sensationalized, or manipulated? Witnesses with no reason to distort the evidence are more desirable than those who might benefit from a particular presentation of the evidence. So, P, primary or secondary. R, do they have a reason to lie? O, are there other witnesses, statements, recordings, or evidence which report the same date, the same information, or the same knowledge? Having other evidence verify the initial evidence strengthens the argument. So O stands for others, or other witnesses. And then the final P, is it a public or a private statement? If the person making the statement of evidence knew or intended that other people should hear it, then it is a public statement. A private statement may be judged more accurate because it was probably said in confidence and is therefore more likely to reflect the speaker's true feelings or observations. So, P, primary or secondary. R, reason to lie. O, other witnesses. P, public or private. These four factors, PROP or PROP, will be enough to evaluate most evidence that you encounter. And I want to mention that I have had students come back years later and still tell me that they are using PROP, especially when evaluating things in the newspaper. Does the person have a reason to lie about what they're saying? Are there other sources for the same information that you're reading in the newspaper? And is the person being interviewed a primary source or a secondary source? Those are all very important things to ask, whether you're reading history or you're reading history in the making in the form of a newspaper today. I'm going to pull some of the quotes that we used last week to do homework with to show you how to use prop. So this is not in your critical thinking guide. This is just in the PowerPoint. So here we go. Number 1, Anne Hutchinson was an intelligent and strong-willed woman for her time. According to Governor Winthrop, Anne had a ready wit and a bold spirit. So the first question we're going to ask, is there a source given for the information in the argument? And in this case, yes, there is. We're told that Governor John Winthrop is the source of this information about her being intelligent and strong-willed. So, if yes, there is a source, evaluate the evidence and explain your evaluation. So the first P is going to be primary or secondary. R, do they have a reason to lie? O, are there other sources listed? And P, was this a private or a public statement? So let's go ahead and evaluate what Governor John Winthrop has to say. So P, primary or secondary. Governor Winthrop is a primary source because he actually knew Anne Hutchinson. Did Governor Winthrop have a reason to lie? Probably not, just because this is a very complimentary thing that he has to say about her. And Governor Winthrop actually, you're going to be reading about this next week, he actually helped convict Anne Hutchinson and banish her from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so he had no reason to say nice things about her. Are other sources given? No, there are no other sources given. And was this a public statement or a private statement that he made? Actually, the source doesn't tell us whether it was public or private. It was probably public, otherwise it wouldn't have been written down and remembered for all of history. Remember, though, that it also asks you to explain your evaluation. So we're going to go ahead and say that this was a pretty strong assertion that Anne Hutchinson was intelligent and strong-willed, since we have a primary source who had no reason to lie. It could be stronger if other sources had been given, or if they had told us that this was a private statement or a letter that he wrote, which it may have been, but we're not sure. All right, example number 2. Again, this is not in your critical thinking guide. This is just on the PowerPoint. Number 2 says, many Native American tribes received European explorers and colonists with curiosity and friendliness. Some tribes helped to save a number of European settlements from starvation. Others freely shared skills needed for survival in the Americas. So we're going to ask the question, is there a source given for any information in this argument? And in this case, no, there was none given. So it says, if not, the argument is not well supported by evidence, and we can move on. Number 3, although most Europeans arriving in America during the 16th century considered Native Americans to be uncivilized, according to A.A. Pierce, professor of Mesoamerican Studies at Harvard University, both the Aztec and the Inca built large cities, established their own religious beliefs, and developed skills in such disciplines as math, astronomy, and art. Therefore, a number of great Native American civilizations existed in the Americas at the time of European exploration and conquest. So, is there a source given for any information in this argument? In this case, yes, there is. The source is A.A. Pierce, professor of Mesoamerican Studies at Harvard University. So then it says, if yes, evaluate the evidence and explain your evaluation. Again, P stands for primary or secondary. R, do they have a reason to lie? O, other sources listed. And P, was this a public or private statement? So, in this case, A.A. Pierce is a secondary source. Even if he is an expert who is at Harvard University, he wasn't living at the time, and so he's not a primary source. Does A.A. Pierce have a reason to lie? Hopefully not. So we're just going to go ahead and give him the benefit of the doubt. I will say that sometimes professors do lie to you, and so, but we're going to go ahead and give A.A. Pierce the benefit of the doubt. We don't think that he has a reason to lie about the Mesoamerican native people. Are other sources listed? No, not this time. And was this a public or a private statement? It was probably public, otherwise we wouldn't know that the person had said it. It might have been written in a textbook, for example, written by Professor A.A. Pierce of Harvard University, but we're not sure. And so we're going to go ahead and explain our evaluation. This may be true, but it's not a strong argument without more supporting evidence. If they had listed a primary source, for example, a letter written or a journal entry written by a conquistador who told us that, yes, these civilizations were fairly advanced, that they had these skills, then it would have been stronger. Actually, those things do exist, and so this argument could have been a lot stronger if the person writing it had gone ahead and offered more information than they did. All right, so what is in your homework this week is lesson 3. And this is what you're going to be doing at home as part of your homework. So notice that the PROP and what each of those letters stand for are up at the top of the page so that you don't forget what they are. And then we have a list of several arguments or assertions that you're going to read through and you're going to evaluate using PROP. And so we're going to go through 2 of those together, and then you're going to do the rest of them at home on your own. So number 1 says, the city government under Mayor Elwell was very corrupt. Over $15 million was stolen in only 5 years. That should have an exclamation point on it. So first of all, is there a source given for any information in this argument? In this case, no, there is no source given. It tells you that $15 million were stolen. We don't know where that information came from, and so we have no idea. So if not, the argument is not well supported by the evidence, and on we go. Number 2, Kurt is a great hitter. The statistics from last season's scorebook show he hit a .457, which is a very high average. So, is there a source given for any information in this argument that Kurt is a great hitter? In this case, yes, there is. We have the scorebook cited as evidence. If yes, evaluate the evidence and explain your evaluation. So remember, P stands for primary or secondary. R, reason to lie. O, other sources listed. And finally, the last P, public or private. The scorebook would be a primary source. Whoever wrote in the scorebook was there watching the games, and they recorded exactly what Kurt hit or missed during the games, and so that is considered a primary source. Does the scorebook have a reason to lie? No. It's just a piece of paper that has written down all the statistics from each of the games, and so there's no reason to lie about that. Are any other sources listed? No, there aren't. Was this public or private? Technically, it's public, although they don't publish scorebooks in the newspaper or anything, and so you might also argue that it's private, but because if anybody wants to come see the scorebook, they're allowed to, we're going to go ahead and list it as public. So, explain your evaluation. We're going to say that this is a strong argument. It is a primary source with no reason to lie, and if you had some other sources, it might be stronger, but it's a pretty strong argument just at face value. So, having said that, this next week, go ahead and complete lesson 3 for critical thinking. And if you have any problems doing that, remember that you can always email one of your instructors. So we're going to move on. And one of the things that you're learning as you do your critical thinking is the importance of consulting with primary sources. And so I'm going to talk about just briefly why we chose to use primary sources in our history class this year. So I have copied here on PowerPoint one of the pages that you had to read this past week. And it is a lesson on the Virginia colony. And it mentions that the colonists immediately set to work building rough huts for shelter. By June 1607, they had also constructed a tiny triangular fort surrounded by a fence of wooden stakes for protection against the Native Americans in the area. And so if we were going to evaluate this based on PROP, primary or secondary, there's no primary source listed. We're taking the author of the textbook's word that she's telling us the truth. Now, I mentioned before that I really like the All-American History textbook, and I think that the author does do a good job. But in terms of primary or secondary, she is a secondary source for this information. Does she have a reason to lie? No, she doesn't have a reason to lie. Are other sources listed? No, there are no other sources listed. And finally, public or private. We're reading a textbook, and so the source that we have for our information is public. So in terms of the argument, obviously she is writing a narrative history rather than an analytical history here. Remember, we talked about the difference between narrative and analytical history on the first day of class last week. And so the argument here is not overt. She's just telling a story. The colonists immediately set to work building rough huts, I think is what she's trying to tell you, and that she says that they were finished by June 1607 as part of her evidence. Now, that tells you something, and that's good information. You might get better information about the kinds of things that were built if you've ever gone to Jamestown and visited the reconstructed fort that they have for tourists. So that would give you some good information about it also. But in terms of wanting to confirm the information, wanting to confirm how the historians who replicated the fort got their ideas about what the fort was shaped like and how many buildings there were, you really need to be able to turn to primary sources. And luckily, we have documented and printed sources that we can turn back to. Captain John Smith, who you read about this past week, immediately began to write letters back to England. Those letters were compiled in a book that was published and marketed as a history of Jamestown. And so we're going to take some time just to look at what Captain Smith said and see if we can confirm what our textbook author said about how quickly they began to build these rough huts and shelters. We'll go ahead and expand what John Smith said so that we can look at it. And I'm going to change it from script into print so that it's a little bit easier to read. And notice the variations in the spelling that Captain Smith used versus the modern spelling. So we're going to go ahead and read through this, and I think it would be easier to do it with the modern spelling. So here we go. He says, "You shall understand that after many crosses in the downs by tempests, in other words, storms, we arrived safely upon the southwest part of the Great Canary," he's talking about the Canary Islands, "within 4 or 5 days after we set sail from Dominica. Of April, the first land we made, we fell with Cape Henry." And you'll remember that you read this past week that they first landed in an area that they called Cape Henry. It was by the very mouth of the Bay of Chesapeake, which at present we little expected, having by a cruel storm been put to the northward. And so he's telling you that we really thought that we were going to end up further south along the coast, and we ended up, because of a storm, yet another storm, that we ended up being a little further north than we had intended. And so we had to find a new place to begin building because this was a place that hadn't been scouted out for us previously. We had to do the scouting ourselves. I'm kind of adding that, but that's what he's trying to get across to his audience. He continues, anchoring in this bay, 20 or 30 went ashore with the captain, and in coming aboard they were assaulted with certain Indians, which charged them within pistol shot, in which conflict Captain Archer and Matthew Morton were shot, whereupon Captain Newport, seconding them, made a shot at them, which the Indians little respected, but having spent their arrows, retired without harm, and in that place was the box opened, wherein the council for Virginia was nominated, and arriving at the place where we are now seated, the council was sworn. The president was elected, which for that year was Master Edward Maria Wingfield, where was made choice for our situation a very fit place for the erecting of a great city, about which some contention passed between Captain Wingfield and Captain Gosnold. Notwithstanding, all our provisions were brought ashore, and with as much speed as might be, we went about our fortification. And so here is the primary evidence. He says that they stopped at Cape Henry. They were attacked by some of the natives that were there. 2 people got shot by arrows. They shot with guns back, and because the Indians had already used up all their arrows, they departed, and that they had been sent the box. And you read about this in your reading this past week. They were sent the metal box. They opened it up, and they were told who was going to be in charge. And from that council that was appointed, they chose a president of the council, and he tells you that that year it was Master Wingfield who was the president of the council. And the very first thing that they want to do is they want to choose a place to go ahead and start building, and that they immediately start building their fortification. So the assertion that the colonists immediately set to work building rough huts for shelter, and that by June of 1607 they had constructed a tiny triangular fort, is confirmed. Now, in addition, your textbook also says that the fort was triangular, and in his letter that we just read, it doesn't actually say that. So where do we go to confirm that information? Well, in addition to sending letters back, John Smith also sent back a sketch of the fort, which was later colorized and published along with the letters in the General History of Jamestown. And so remember that this was one of the source documents that you were asked to evaluate last week. And so here we see that, as drawn by John Smith, that the fort was walled by a palisade that was in a triangular shape, that there were 18 buildings built inside the fort, that they had cannons to protect the fort, and you can see there how it was set up. So that too is confirmed by a source document. This next week, the source documents that you're going to be evaluating are a transcript from the Massachusetts Bay Colony trial of Anne Hutchinson. You're going to be reading about Anne Hutchinson this next week in your All-American History text. And so I thought that it would be interesting to pull in just a small section of the trial that they put her through. You can see the kinds of things that she was asked during her trial and the kinds of answers that she gave. Also, you're going to be reading a letter written by Richard Freethorn, who was an indentured servant that was sent to Jamestown Colony in the year 1623. For both the trial transcript and for the letter, I did go ahead and read through it, and I tried to modernize some of the language so that it would be more understandable to you. But occasionally I felt like that even still the documents needed a little bit more information. So be on the lookout for notes down at the bottom of the page that explain a little bit more about what's going on in each of the source documents. For each of the source documents this week, I've asked several questions that I would like you to answer. In written form, go ahead and write out your answer. And please try to use complete sentences as much as possible. Now, as I've mentioned before, if you have any questions about reading through the source document, understanding it, or being able to answer any of the questions, the first person that you need to check with is your mom or your dad or whoever's homeschooling you this year. Even an older sibling would be a good person to check with. So if you're having a struggle answering the questions, first check with somebody in your family. And if after checking with somebody in your family, you still are struggling to answer the questions, remember that you're always encouraged and allowed to email one of your instructors. For the last few minutes of class, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Pilgrims, who they were, how they arrived in the New World, and why they wanted to come. And so the story of the Pilgrims really starts back in England. We see here a picture of All Saints Church in Babworth, England. And this is where the story of the Pilgrims really begins. But we're going to back up just a little bit and discuss Henry VIII. Now, when Henry was born, of course, England was a Catholic country, and Henry was raised a devout Catholic. Around 1517, a German priest named Martin Luther began to criticize the Catholic Church because some of the beliefs that they promoted that he felt were not biblical. And Luther's disagreement with the Catholic Church escalated into what we now know as the Reformation. As a Christian king, Henry took the side of the Catholic Church, and in fact he read through some of Luther's arguments and came up with answers to those arguments and published them. And for his defense of the church, the Pope gave him the honorary title Defender of the Faith. Henry was actually the younger son of Henry VII. His older brother Arthur had been raised to be the king, but when Arthur died, suddenly Henry was the heir to the throne. Henry married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, and in 1529, after several years of marriage that produced no male heirs, Henry asked Pope Clement to annul his marriage to Catherine to free him up to marry someone else who could provide Henry with a male heir. The Pope refused to annul Henry's marriage, and in 1534, Henry decided that he was going to take matters into his own hands. He had a law passed called the Acts of Supremacy, which made him the head of the Church of England instead of the Pope. And by doing this, Henry broke England's tie to the Catholic Church. Henry immediately confiscated all lands held by the Catholic Church. He transferred some of the lands to noblemen who had been faithful to him, and he transferred some of the lands to the newly formed Church of England. And so like the Catholic Church itself, many of the holdings of the Catholic Church fell into disrepair. Because Henry's main complaint with the Catholic Church was that they would not give him an annulment for his marriage, he didn't really want to go as far as other Protestants had done in Europe. He didn't want to follow Luther. He still disagreed with Luther. And so many of the practices in the Church of England were similar to the practices in the Catholic Church. For example, the vestments that the clergy in the Anglican Church wore were very similar to the vestments that Catholic priests wore. And the way that the new Church of England administered the sacraments like baptism of infants, communion or the Eucharist, and marriage were very, very similar to how the sacraments were performed in the Catholic Church. Henry did allow them to translate an English version of the Bible. However, the translation was very careful not to go against any of the sacred teachings that Henry himself had grown up with and cherished. Some Christians in England felt like that Henry had not gone far enough. And so here we are back at All Saints Church in Babworth, England. Now, in later years, William Bradford described how the Separatists in the area of England around Babworth decided to separate themselves from the Church of England. And we read, "In one of these churches was Mr. Richard Clifton, a grave and reverend preacher, who by his pains and diligence had done much good, and under God had been a means of the conversion of many, and also that famous and worthy man, Mr. John Robinson, who afterwards was their pastor for many years, till the Lord took him away by death, and also Mr. William Brewster." So it was the preaching of Richard Clifton that really launched what became the Pilgrim movement into the New World. Richard Clifton was born around the year of 1553. He attended the University of Cambridge, which at the time had become a hotbed for dissenting theology within the Church of England. And when he graduated in 1586, he was given the church at Babsworth to pastor. Sometime in the 1590s, he began to preach dissenting religious views and to conduct services using prayers that weren't officially authorized in the Church of England Book of Prayers. And his preaching had such life and such exuberance to it that people began to come from surrounding areas, surrounding cities, to come and listen to Richard Clifton. And one of those people was the famous Pilgrim father, William Brewster. Brewster was living about 7 miles away from Babworth at the time. He was a young man, and he was so moved by the messages that Clifton preached that he began to regularly attend the services in Babworth. Several years later, around 1602, William Bradford also began to attend the church. He lived about 10 miles away from Babworth, and he had to pass William Brewster's estate on the way, and so the two began to walk to and from services together. Eventually, Clifton's preaching and his Puritan methods of conducting his services came to the attention of church authorities, and he was accused of being a nonconformist and a non-subscriber. And in 1605, he was stripped of the pastorship of the Babsworth congregation. William Brewster offered to allow him to start meeting at his manor in the city of Scrooby, and so they formed a home church in William Brewster's home. It was considered to be a Separatist congregation. By 1607, the Scrooby congregation, as well as another congregation in Gainsborough, had experienced so much persecution that they decided that they needed to leave England, and they chose to flee to Holland. The Dutch allowed a lot more religious freedom than the English did, and so a group from both of the congregations ended up emigrating to the city of Amsterdam and building a church building where the two congregations could meet. Eventually there was some theological controversy between Clifton and the other Separatist minister, a man named John Smith, not to be mistaken with Captain John Smith, a different man. Smith had come to the belief that Scripture should never be translated, that it should be preached from the original Greek and Hebrew, and that if a minister was going to translate it, that he should translate it under the power of the Holy Spirit on the spur of the moment as he was preaching. He also had some other controversial ideas about baptism, and he and Clifton began to argue. And in order to have a more peaceful life, most of the members of the Scrooby congregation decided that they were going to move from Amsterdam to the city of Leiden. Amsterdam was a big city. In addition to the controversy between the two ministers, they also felt like moving to a smaller town would give them more economic opportunity. Very few of them had come from a city. Most of them were farmers. And so they decided that if they moved to a smaller city, that more of them would be able to find gainful employment. And so the congregation from Scrooby split and ended up moving to the Dutch city of Leiden. Economically, they did do better in the city of Leiden. However, they became concerned that their children were picking up some of the permissive habits of their Dutch neighbors, and they felt like that staying in a foreign country was not a good long-term solution to their desire to have freedom of religion. And so the rest, as they say, is history. They petitioned the King of England for permission to emigrate to the Americas, and eventually they were granted permission to do that. They ended up hiring two ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower. And in July 1620, they left the city of Leyden and set out on their adventure to colonize the New World. Now, most of the congregation was traveling from Leyden in the Speedwell, and they ended up meeting up with the Mayflower in Britain and set on their way. Unfortunately, the Speedwell started taking on water, and they had to pull back into an English port at Southampton and have repairs done on the Speedwell. Once those repairs were completed, they went ahead and started back out, and the Speedwell started taking on water again. At this point, they decided that the Speedwell was not a trustworthy ship, and so they made their way to Plymouth in England and made the decision to leave the Speedwell behind. Unfortunately, that meant that they were going to have to leave some of the congregation behind also. By the time they set out from England this time, it was late in the season. And as you read this past week, they didn't end up arriving in the New World until late November. At this point, it was too late to plant any crops. They were thrown off course by storms, and the decision was made, as you read, to go ahead and disembark where they found themselves rather than travel down the coast to the area of Virginia that they had originally planned to settle in. Before we go any further, I'd like to go ahead and talk a little bit about the difference between Pilgrims and Puritans, because often those two are sort of combined as being the same people, and they weren't. Now, I'm going to pull out this Venn diagram, and in terms of what they had in common, both the Pilgrims and the Puritans disagreed with the Church of England. They both wanted religious freedom. They both ended up settling a colony in Massachusetts. However, they also had a lot of things that were different about them. For example, the Pilgrims were actually Separatists rather than Puritans. The Separatists wanted to separate from the Church of England, while the Puritans wanted to stay inside the Church of England and purify it from inside. The Pilgrims tended to come from working class and farmer families, while the Puritans came from all classes. A lot of them were higher class people, and they were a lot better educated than the Pilgrims were. The Pilgrims came earlier. They left about 1620. Meanwhile, the Puritans left England later, around 1630. The Pilgrims settled Plymouth Plantation, and the major leaders of the Pilgrims were William Brewster and William Bradford. Meanwhile, the Puritans settled Massachusetts Bay Colony and ended up building 7 towns. Their leaders were John Winthrop and John Endicott. The Pilgrims gave freedom to the strangers that were mixed in with them. Meanwhile, the Puritans were known for requiring strict conformity to the rules, or they would banish you. The Pilgrims endeavored to have peace with the tribal people, while the Puritans ended up having a very tense relationship with the tribal people. There are probably other differences, but the last one I'm going to mention is that the Pilgrims came over with a small number of people, only 120, and they were all squashed on one ship. Meanwhile, the Puritans had over 1,000 come in that first initial voyage, and they brought 15 ships with them. Now, at this point in class, we are going to stop and we're going to report on the pilgrim that we were assigned last week. Those of you who are at home watching the video don't get to participate in that. I'm sorry about that. But since we have a little bit of time left over, I thought that I would mention that I looked up William Brewster. Now, I asked you to find 3 things about the person that you were assigned, whether they were a saint or a stranger, whether they lived that first year or whether they died during that first year that they were in the New World, and just try and find an interesting fact about them. And so, William Brewster, as one of the leaders of the Pilgrims, obviously was one of the saints. He did survive that first year. And in fact, the interesting information that I found about him is that about 30 million Americans can trace their ancestry back to William Brewster. I thought that that was very, very interesting. One reason that I find that interesting is because of my mother's family. Now, when we were growing up, she used to tell us a lot of stories about her childhood, and one of the things that she told us was that there was some oral tradition in her family that while her family had not come over on the Mayflower, that they had come over on one of the other ships that came a year or 2 years afterwards, and they were part of the Pilgrim congregation. And so when my oldest brother was an adult, he started doing some genealogical research, and he discovered that the ancestor, that the oral history was fairly accurate, and the ancestor that they were talking about was Jonathan Brewster, who is William Brewster's son. So apparently he had a wife, and his wife was pregnant at the time, and because of her pregnancy, they made the decision to go ahead and stay behind when the Speedwell wasn't able to make the journey. And so he and his wife stayed behind, and the baby was born in England. And then about a year later, they came over on one of the boats to join the other pilgrims that had survived that first year. So on the one hand, my mother's family's oral tradition was correct, but on the other hand, they were incorrect because William Brewster, his father, had come over on the Mayflower. So I thought that that was interesting, and I wanted to share it with you. So we're going to go ahead and stop there for today. I hope that you enjoy your reading this next week. And if you have any questions, I just want to remind you one more time that you are always, always encouraged and free to email one of your instructors.